Hi, I'm Mitch Gallagher. Welcome to GearFest 2018. We have a special guest with us here in the studio. This is Kevin Killen. Great to see you.
You too, Mitch. Thanks for having me.
Taking time to sit down with us today.
More than happy to.
So Universal Audio sponsored your visit as part of GearFest.
They have, yes.
Yeah, you did a panel with our friend Fab DuPont.
I did, and it was really good fun. And I was showcasing an artist called Rosie Darling, and also just taking people through my workflow in a mix mode. And
right.
Had a lot of universal plugs in there, so pretty much my default settings and everything. So yeah, it was really good fun.
Nice. I stuck my head in briefly, and I was going from one panel to another, and I stuck my head in, and there was so much great stuff you were talking about. Really, practical information that people could take stuff away. So that's really very cool.
Well, at my nature, I'm quite practical, and I always like try and impart that onto potential clients and music lovers. Just like, hey, there's an easy way to make a record, and there's a very difficult way to make a record. And it's just so much more fun if you take the easy route.
Right. So you have such a tremendous career and so many great credits and so many amazing things that you've done. Peter Gabriel and U2, and the list is just endless. Kate Bush, just a tremendous library and legacy of work you've done. But I have to ask you a question. I read something that when you started, the reason you got hired at your first assistantship is because of the jacket you were wearing.
That is so true.
Is that really your qualification?
Actually, that was my qualification. Well, according to the person who interviewed me at the time, and it was a gentleman by the name of Pat Murphy, a very typical Irish name, and he was a kind of a crusty old curmudgeon who ran the studio. He drank way too much coffee and just chain smoked endlessly, and he was really trying to dissuade me from going into the business.
Right.
But he said, you work shitty hours, and you get shitty pay, you never see your friends. Why the hell would you want to do this? And I said, well, I'm really interested in music. He goes, well, where'd you get that jacket? I said, that's my dad's jacket. Okay, you got good taste. Okay, you're hired. And I literally had a white jacket that belonged to my dad. It was cut to the waist, and he just liked he liked the cut of it. And he said, okay, you must be a pretty decent kid. Come on in.
Right, that's awesome.
Yeah, so that literally was it. I had gone around to all the studios in Dublin trying to get hired as an apprentice, because that was really the period where people still were apprenticing in studios.
Right.
But Pat was kind enough to hire me there. It was called Lombard Sound at the time, and then it changed names a number of years later.
Right.
But it was a really, really fabulous training.
Right. So you came in as an assistant, or
came as assistant, yeah. Like literally the first day, I remember the engineer was Philip Begley was his name. The producer's name was Bill Whelan. The artist was Mick Hanley. Nice. And I had no idea what I was doing. They pointed. See that stand? Take that over, put it over there. Here's a cable, connect that. Here's a microphone. It's called this. You know what I mean? I learned, and then it was like I just had a million questions. Why do we do this? Why do you do that?
Right.
And learned on the job. And obviously you build your knowledge base up by trial and error. And it was a very busy studio. It was a jingle house in the morning time, like a lot of studios in those days were. So you learn to become very efficient when you're running jingle sessions. And then the lunchtime to 7, 8, 9 o'clock sessions were like typical album projects.
Okay.
Ranging from pop to rock to punk to Irish folk music to some classical pieces. And then the graveyard shift where young assistants like myself got to cut our teeth. That's where like emerging punk bands were coming and new wave bands out of Ireland. Everybody was trying to get signed to a major label. U2 had just kind of broken onto the scene, so everybody was trying to get signed.
Right.
That elusive record contract,
Right.
And so the 11 o'clock to 7 a.m. shift was the graveyard shift, where the young assistants got to try everything they witnessed during the daytime, see if they could replicate it at nighttime. And then we'd have a review period every once a week where the engineers would come and listen to our work that we'd done, and they'd critique it. It was a really great training for what I do now.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
right,
fantastic.
Right. So how long was it before you made the leap to being the lead engineer, or the first engineer, if you will?
It happened over time. So in that studio, I started to develop my own client roster. Like a lot of them were young bands who'd come in and do the late night sessions. And then one of the jingle writers, he started to hire me to do all his demo jingle sessions. So that was just the pitch for the actual commercial itself.
Right.
And so they were really down and dirty, like 2 hours, maybe 3 or 4 musicians. You'd do a 2-minute spot, a 1-minute spot, and then you'd edit it down to 30 seconds and 15 seconds. So you learn to become quite good at those kind of things.
Sure.
And I became his de facto engineer for about 1.5 years, and I was beginning to do not album releases, but single releases and that kind of stuff, and I was starting to build up a body of work. But it was all local artists at that time. And this client Jerry, he took my demo reel down to like the premier studio in Dublin at the time called Windmill Lane, and he did a full-fledged commercial there that one afternoon. And at the end of that, he played he asked the house engineer, who was also the owner of the studio, to transfer my show reel across onto a cassette. And so the engineer, Brian, I had, Masterson is his name, I had interviewed with him when I was first looking for a gig. And he listened to the reel and he said, oh, who did this? And Jerry was like, oh, this young engineer, Kevin. And he said, what's his personality like? He could already hear that I, good instinct.
Right.
And he said, oh, he's really nice, and he's got a good nature, and he's calm and stuff like that. And he called me the next day and offered me a spot down there. So I then went to the premiere studio. They had 2 full rooms there, and they were getting a lot of international clients because at the time, the British pound and the Irish pound had been linked for so many years, and they had broken parity. So the Irish pound had dropped about 15% in value. So a lot of the UK labels were bringing artists over to record in Dublin. Extending the budget by 15-20%. So we were getting a lot of, UB40, 10cc, Gilbert Sullivan, just to name 3.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And did you, if I remember correctly, you actually stepped back to being an assistant when you moved over to that studio, right?
No. So I partially went back to being an assistant there, but obviously brought some clients with me, and then I learned under the auspices of Brian and Bill Somerville-Large, who was the other house engineer, and Bill was more, he'd made a career at CTS Studios in London doing mostly classical stuff and jazz, so like just that whole approach to making those kind of records is different from making a pop record. So I assisted him for a number of months just to kind of get that experience under my belt.
Right.
And then, yet again, I got to a certain level at the studio. My apprenticeship probably lasted about 5 or 6 years. But at that point, I was already doing, album projects on my own, either as the engineer or sometimes assistant and engineer, doing 2 roles together.
Sure.
And then I kind of had reached as far as I could go there, and I had to become like an independent engineer. So the choice was like, do I stay as an independent engineer in Dublin, or do I travel further afield? So my last project I did through Windmill Lane was U2's Unforgettable Fire. Right. And so part of that record was recorded up at Slane Castle, which was like 40 miles north of the city. And U2, the previous year, had recorded a show at Red Rocks in Colorado. And this gentleman by the name of Randy Israeli had basically built a remote recording studio and put it in flight cases. And so he was the facilitator of that recording. And so when the band were in Slane Castle rehearsing, they said, hey, we like the way our music sounds here. Why don't we bring the studio to us? Randy got hired to bring over his equipment, and I was, put on the project as the, de facto windmill engineer. So I went up to Slane and worked all the gear, and became friends with Randy. And then when I thought about where I wanted to go, I thought maybe I should go to New York. So I arrived here in '84, and I've been here ever since.
Right, nice. So that's kind of a challenge to record in a castle.
Yeah.
You certainly have some different acoustical spaces to deal with.
And this was not like, when you say castle, people think, oh, this must be this beautiful structure, but it was kind of a run-down castle. Right. In a lot of ways. It really hadn't seen a lot of maintenance over the years. So there were a lot of cool spaces, and there was one room called the Great Ballroom, and it sounds much grander than it actually was, but just there was a reverberation time of about 4 seconds in there. So it was kind of cool for certain things, but not for everything. Right. And then there were some other dead spaces that we would put amps in. But the band just liked the vibe, and they liked the fact that they weren't in a traditional studio environment, and they just felt like they wanted to make a different kind of statement, so therefore they wanted to be in a different place. Right. We ultimately ended up back at Windmill for the last few weeks of the album, and we finished it there. But it gave them the kind of the luxury of just being a little more free with their time and not having people just pop in at any moment in time. So it was great.
Right. Yeah, that's very cool. Yeah. You have a few. You've worked in some other unconventional spaces as well. Wasn't part of Peter Gabriel's So? Wasn't that done in a cowshed? Is that right?
Yeah. His studio was actually a converted cowshed. So he'd rented this farmhouse from a local farmer just outside of Bath, and he'd had that space for a number of years. And he turned the cowshed, what had been a cowshed, into a studio. And it really wasn't a very acoustically treated space. So the larger of the 2 spaces, which was the recording space, was quite lively. It was a lot of concrete and stuff like that. And then there was some baffling on the walls, but not a lot. He actually had a PA in there as well. And everything was set up like a drum set. And we had various like guitar stations and bass stations, keyboard stations set up there. And the band could go in and rehearse at any moment in time. They could hear it through the PA. But also the control room was like one room removed. So there was like a little ante-room in between the recording space and the control room, and then the control room, you stepped up into the space and you were facing away from the recording space, so there was no visual contact. There was no glass window into the recording space. And weirdly enough, that control room sounded really good. It shouldn't have, but it just did. Right. Just a freak of Yeah.
Yeah, you just never know. When
you never know.
Sometimes it's going to be perfect.
Yeah. So, you know, I had like 2 records, like the U2 record and that record, quick succession, that were in non-traditional environments. And I was like, oh yeah, this is going to work. You know, you don't have to be in a purpose-built room, you know, to make a great sounding record.
Right, which is, you know, of course now, today, so many people are working at home or in project studios and things, and it certainly is holding true in a lot of cases.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right. So you've talked in the past about recording, so and kind of it was like a 10-month project, is that right?
Well, I was hired to go there for, it was presented as, you'll be here for 4 to 6 weeks. And when I got picked up at Heathrow and on the way, the 3-hour drive down to Bath, Peter's assistant, Dave Stahlbaumer, said to me, well, how long do you think you're going to be here for? And it was basically the beginning of summer, so I had a little small summer bag of, you know, like 3 weeks worth of clothes with me. And I thought, yeah, it's England in the summer. It's going to be nice warm weather. And he said, oh, yeah, you'll be here till next March. And this was beginning of June. And I'm thinking, that's 10 months away. And he goes, yeah. And he was right. I left March 17th.
Is that right? You predicted that?
Yeah, he was. And he had worked for Peter for 4 or 5 years in various capacities. So he knew Peter's, you know, he knew his arc in terms of how he made records and stuff like that. And Peter would, you know, I got there. Some of the tracks had been recorded. A lot of tracks were in very long form. They needed to be edited down significantly, and there'd been a whole issue with the two tape machines and the synchronizer, that tapes weren't syncing up correctly, and that was a whole project in and of itself. Just that aspect of the recording.
Right.
And Peter and Dan especially wanted to make sure that we always had tracks available to record every day if the creative flow was inspiring, and so yeah. So yeah, it ended up being 10 months.
Yeah, it sounds like, anyway, based on what I've kind of read about the project, that it was kind of a stream of consciousness kind of thing, where it just kind of progressed and then kind of mixed as you went, and when you were finished, you kind of had the...
Yeah, there was a certain point in the recording after we had done, like after Peter was really beginning to hone in on lyrics, and we started to kind of really put shape onto the arrangement of the songs, where he felt comfortable enough in inviting the record label down. So at the time he was signed with Virgin in the UK. It was Virgin in the UK and Europe, and then it was Geffen here in the US and North America. And so we decided that, you know, we were going to present to them like a pretty good rough mix of what we had thus far.
Right.
And so, you know, we spent time doing rough mixes and, you know, maybe just balancing everything and equalizing and making sure all our effects were cool. And it was on the SSL 4000E, and so we documented everything, and we were documenting everything as we went along anyway. But those mixes, you know, garnered such a strong response, positive response from both labels, that we thought it really behooves us to, next time we come back to the songs, to start from that place.
Right.
So we, in essence, we didn't have a traditional mix period. It was kind of started in September and kind of elongated right through until mid-February, when we actually mastered the album.
All right.
Yeah. So it wasn't like faders down, reconceive what this record is going to be. It was like there was an actual roadmap all along. So it was a very unusual way of working, but actually ultimately a very beneficial way of.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, there's so much creativity involved in that whole project.
Right.
And was that being driven by Peter? Daniel Lanois was involved, and obviously you were contributing as well with all that. Was it how collaborative was the effort, I guess?
I think it was very collaborative, because, you know, Peter is very open, and so is Dan, and if anybody had a good idea, it doesn't really matter where the idea comes from, as long as it's a musical idea and it's something can be executed quickly, and you can capture quickly, so you can at least hear the essence of the idea against the music.
Right.
Then, you know, I think everybody was always open to it, and the rule of thumb then was, you know, Peter was really into sampling keyboards. He had a Fairlight. We had like a Yamaha CP70, and there was an emulator. And he had a Prophet 5, and the golden rule was we couldn't use any stock sound. So if you pulled up a sound on any of the keyboards or any of the guitars, you had to modify it in some way. So oftentimes we would combine instruments together to make one sound. So sometimes you have a couple of keyboards and a guitar, or a couple of guitars and a keyboard, or maybe all keyboards simultaneously. Right. You know, and you would morph the sound using effects and modifying the parts and seeing what other people were contributing, and it would create a more unusual texture or part.
Right.
So yeah, I was really creative. You know, I mean, I was a young engineer, and I was being pushed on so many different levels, not just creatively, but also architecturally as well, in terms of like how to engineer this project that was really dense, and also be able to retrieve information that they thought was lost through the synchronization issue, and get it back onto the master, and then create a workflow that made it as seamless as possible. So I was, you know, I was 25. I was like, I was in heaven.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And I was a big Genesis fan, so
sure.
You know, so to get to work with Peter on a solo record was a thrill of a lifetime. And he's a super nice man.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
Even better.
Yeah. And we had a daily ritual. Peter's 2 daughters were quite young. I mean, they were in elementary school at the time, so he was always up early. and he would drop the kids off to school, and then he would come to the studio by about 9:15. You know, which is kind of early for a studio, but we just start working, and then he'd be out of the studio by 7 in the evening because he wanted to be home for when they were going to bed, and Dan and I would have like certain projects slated for the evening time, either an overdub or something that we had to get done, and we would do that in the evening time. But during the daytime, Peter would always like take about 45 minutes, and we would do a little group run. It was myself, Peter, David Rhodes, and sometimes Tony Levin, and we'd go running up Salisbury Hill.
There you go.
You know, and it's, you know, if you listen to the lyric, it's true what he says.
How cool is that?
Yeah, it's really cool.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And it's just it's a great way to get out of the studio and decompress. And Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So what a tremendous opportunity as a young engineer to work with producers like Lanois and Lil White and Brian Eno also, you know, and then as you moved into producing yourself, what did you take away from that?
You know, you take different things from different people, but the thing about it is, and I think what I learned from all of them, especially from Dan and Brian, was like you have to be a master of your own craft first before you can suddenly become a master of something else. So I felt like I had to become a really good engineer before I, you know, set my stall up as a producer. And in fact, I didn't really try and set my stall up as a producer. I always felt like every time I was in the studio, regardless of what my role was, that I was, you know, going to be open to the collaborative process, and I wanted to make everybody feel as included as possible.
Right.
So just by doing that naturally, people started viewing me as a potential producer. And the very first project I was asked to officially produce on was a Mr. Mister album in 1987.
Right.
And they were just coming off their biggest record to date, which was Broken Wings and Kyrie and stuff like that. And when I was approached by the label and by the band management and the band, I was like, why would you not want to work with a person who just yielded you like the biggest hit you've had?
Right.
And they were like, well, we really like the way Peter's record sounds, and we think, you know, you would be, you know, an ideal candidate. And, you know, artists then obviously want to try something different.
Sure.
So I was actually trying to talk myself out of the gig, and they were trying to talk me into it. So what we settled on was we ended up going to the studio for a weekend, and we cut one song. Just to, you know, it was like no pressure, let's see how this goes. And I really liked them. They were great musicians, lovely people, and I thought, yeah, I could make a record with these guys.
Right.
And that was it. Yeah. And then I started getting called as a co-producer, and, you know, but I mean, I also understand what my strengths are and what my weaknesses are. And I thought, well, I'll use this as a platform to learn, you know, a little bit more about my weaknesses and see if I can cover those a little bit more.
Right.
And also learn, you know, and see if I can take my strengths and take them to new heights.
Right.
Yeah.
So as you made that transition, then were you just producing, or were you also engineering at the same time?
I was always engineering.
Okay.
Yeah, I've never not engineered any project I've ever worked on. Ostensibly, that is how I pretty much, you know, that's my base position on any project, is an engineer or mixer. And then even if I'm just hired as an engineer, I'll still throw in arrangement ideas. I feel like if I have an idea in it, I think it's valid, and the artist is open to it, I'm going to make a suggestion.
Sure.
Because ultimately, you know, you're there to serve the artist and the music, and that's really what we're hired to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So it took a while because I was still doing some engineering gigs solely, and then sometimes I was just being hired as a mixer. So maybe for the first 5 or 6 years, I probably did 1 or 2 co-productions a year, and then some years it was more, and some years it was less. But it just kind of morphed into a whole other thing.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So given that, how early do you get, or did you get involved in the projects then? Were you there from the beginning, or were you brought in more when it came to the time to actually go into the studio?
It depends on each project. I mean, each one is unique. A lot of times, the artist would have created demos and stuff like that, and then you get introduced to them, or you might have seen them live and you would have approached them to see what their situation was. But if it was at the beginning, and they were about to make a record, then obviously you're getting involved in song choices and personnel and studios and budgeting and stuff like that. That's certainly one aspect of the production. And then if it's more like you're just involved as the mixer, you're hired as the mixer, then obviously you're taking your cues from the producer and the band and the artist. And then you're still applying production skills to the mix, because you're thinking, a lot of times people over-record, and you know, as a mixer, I still hear it as a producer. I'm thinking, you don't need that part here. Like, that's too much clutter. Let's remove that. You know, so you're thinking of it as an arranger in that sense. So, you know, some people just think of mixer just getting a good balance, but it's also about, there's a reason why this balance isn't working. There's too much going on. The human ear can only hear so much. Sure. So you're using your own taste to selectively choose what to feature and what not to feature. Right. So over time, it just became another part of my kind of skill set. You know, I'm not just like, okay, just getting good balances and coming up with good sounds. It's really no, the reason why the mix is not working is because the arrangement is a little flawed. Maybe we need to chop out a verse, or maybe we need to cut this in half. And you make that suggestion. The best way to make the suggestion is actually do it.
Right.
Let me demonstrate what I'm hearing, and then good musicians will hear it immediately and go, yeah, you're right. Why didn't we think of that?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that's when you're working on tracks that have been delivered to you, as opposed to tracks that you're recording.
Yeah. Well, I also we're recording too. I feel like once you're in the studio, it is a collaborative process. The person sitting in the corner could have the best idea that you hadn't thought of. So
sure,
you might as well be open to it.
Right.
It's fun.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. So I believe I read that you like to start your mixes based on the vocal.
Yes.
Whereas some will start with the drums, it'll start with whatever. Tell us why that is. Why do you focus so much on the vocal?
Well, because a lot of the artists I work with are vocal-centric, so I feel like that's the real storytelling part of the arrangement, and it's really key to what they're trying to project through the song. And so I had a seminal moment with Elvis Costello and Burt Bacharach back in '97, I believe it was. We made Painted from Memory, and I was hired as the engineer and mixer, and Burt Bacharach came in with his arrangement fully formed. You could look at the lead sheet and it was all written out in front of you. And then during every aspect of that recording arc, he kept removing parts of the arrangement. Like he would take out a little bit of the sax, a little bit of the strings, a little bit of the vocal. And he was removing things instead of adding them. You always think of the recording process as being an additive process, but he actually had it all mapped out in the beginning. And we had this conversation when we got to mix. He said, let's start with the vocal. And up until that point, I'd always been, rhythm section, get the vocal in fairly quickly, but, rhythm section first. He's like, start with the voice, and then whatever the main melodic instrument is that supports the vocal. This case was mostly piano. And then we worked our way down to the mix. And so we did a couple of these, and they went very fast. And yes, we knew the material because we'd recorded and we'd spent 6 weeks working together. But I remember asking what it is about this process that, makes it, you start with the vocal. He goes, well, this is the story. And our job is the oral author of this, right? We have to present this. And he said, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to present it in such a way where it's really interesting to the listener at every moment, but I don't overwhelm them, and I don't give them that one motif one too many times so that they don't want to go back and hear it again. I want to entice them to go back and hear it again. So I strip it down to its bare essence, but it's still like a beautiful little mini movie.
Right.
And it was a really interesting insight, and I thought, yeah, starting with the vocal, like that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
You create the space for the voice, you wrap the main melodic instrument around it, and then you find you're not squashing the voice and you're not trying to squeeze it into something. You've already created the space for it in which to reside, and then everything else can wrap around it. It just became a flow of work that I really enjoyed, and so that's been 20 odd years of doing it that way.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I've done it the other way, and I know lots of my friends and colleagues do it that way too. Everybody has their own approach. It's just finding an approach that resonates with you. I find that when I do it that way, I actually get to a better mix more quickly. If it's vocal-centric music. So whatever it is, I'm currently working on a project that's instrumental, but there is a main voice within that instrumental set. It's piano in this instance, so I start with the piano.
Right.
That's what's telling the story.
Right. I was going to ask you actually if it works the same way when you're dealing with the instrumental kind of a
absolutely.
thing.
It does totally work that way.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, I spent years getting kick drum sounds for 4 hours.
Right.
Snare drum sounds for 4 hours. I mean, it doesn't really matter.
Right.
Ultimately, it's what's telling the story.
Right. Yeah. Fascinating. Yeah. Is it also correct that you tend to do a lot of your processing on subgroups as opposed to on individual tracks?
Yes. Yeah. So back in the early 2000s when I first started moving into mixing in the box, from TDM into HD, when delay compensation finally came into being, I just didn't like the way it sounded in the box really to mix. I just felt like it was a little gritty sounding. But I also found that the more plugins I used, the grittier it sounded. So I mixed a record for Peter's label Real World back in 2004 that had a combination of acoustic elements, a lot of frame drums, acoustic guitars, upright bass. Then there was a lot of electronic elements sitting on top of it that had a lot of sub information as well. And I had remixed So in Surround 5.1, and we used the Sony Oxford console. So I got that suite of plugins, and I used it on this particular project. And instead of putting it across all the tracks, I just created subgroups, and I have a drum and bass. It's a drum and percussion group, and then a music subgroup, and then a vocal subgroup, and then I summed that to a little master aux where I do a final bit of like pre-mastering kind of EQ, and then I have a destination track within a session, and I listen through everything through that destination track. So it's like my 2 tracks sitting in the corner on input.
Right.
And I know if I mute that return, if I hear any piece of audio, I know that I haven't assigned everything correctly. So also doing it that way, the architecture of Pro Tools sounds better, you know, to the buses. So I mean, that was that iteration. Anyway, I just got used to that workflow. And also, I've kind of decided over the years that I'd rather use high quality plugins rather than lots of cheap ones. You know, like they're good to have the cheap things to do the weird things, but like if you want to get really pristine sounds, whatever that means to the end user, you need a really great quality user interface and a great quality plugin. So yeah.
Does that open up possibilities? Because what occurs to me is that you know, sometimes you want to compress just the snare or just the kick or whatever, and if you're working on a subgroup, of course you can't quite dial it in that specifically. So do you still do those kind of things, or is it all pretty much just on the subgroups?
It's still pretty much on the subgroups. If something needs an individual attention, then I clearly will go and do that. But I generally start with, I basically have 8 plugins, you know, like EQ and compression that I will start out with. And then I'll have a bunch of auxes that have like effects returns. But basically, I'm trying to drive my whole mix through these 8 plugins. Over the years, I've known that I've witnessed how effective they can be. So, you know, if something I've recorded, then I've already recorded it pretty much the way I want it to sound. So for me, the mix begins in pre-production. So if I'm the engineer on the tracking date, then I know roughly how I want to get that sound.
Sure.
So I'm already thinking ahead, like, do I want to use the compression on the kick drum now, or do I want to not have any compression because I want it to be big and open and just big and warm?
Right.
You know, you make those decisions based on what the needs and what the end use is going to be. And then when you get to mix, then really find that you don't need a lot of EQ. Like, it's just good balance ultimately should give you a good mix. And then you use smaller amounts of processing, and you're not distracted by the processing. Then I'm still in the music. I'm still thinking about the music and the musical balance, as opposed to, you know, there's how many iterations of EQ out right there, and they're all great. Some better than others, but it's really the interface and how you react to the interface and how you can extract what you want out of it quickly. That's what I'm attracted to. So there are certain ones that I just know I will automatically default to those because they've been well thought out, they're well engineered. If they're modeling something from the classic vintage EQ or compressor, you know, something like UAD, they've done their homework, and it does sound authentic and it sounds real. And it's got a couple of knobs, and you can just quickly go, oh yeah, that's giving me the effect I desire. You know, sometimes when you have all the other choices, it just leads to distraction. Yeah.
So you find that that limiting,
you know, like I have a toolkit, and in my toolkit are my favorite tools, and that's where I start. And if I don't have it in that toolkit, then afterwards I may go try something else. But I know I can get it from that toolkit. So if I do my job correctly, I can get it from that. So then I can be more efficient, and I can respond accordingly. So even if a mix is challenging, I should be able to get a good musical balance within 4 or 5 hours. Like something where I feel like, okay, this is pretty close. It might need some refinement, but the overall structure of it is correct. Like the tonal balance of it is right. Yeah, you get into the nano details of it, like, oh, maybe a little bit more high frequency on this thing, but it doesn't, you know, it doesn't dramatically change the balance. It's just like these subtleties that you're looking for, the dimensional aspects of the mix, whether it's something where you're placing it in a stereo field or whether you're placing it in the dimensional field from front to rear, how the listener is perceiving that sound, whether it feels dry or wet or ambient, you know, or some combination, whether you're trying to come up with a new sound that nobody's ever heard of before, you know, which is often the remit. Like, I don't want my voice to sound like a human voice. It sounds like a human voice. Okay, you want me to mess it up? Okay, well, what are we going to use to mess it up? Yeah, you know what I mean. I don't want the piano to sound like a piano. Don't use a piano.
Who would think of that?
Wait, who would think of that? No, but I want it to be a piano. Okay, yeah. So, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's a good. This is a good chance to bring back that Universal Audio is sponsoring you here, and you're obviously using those plugins. Do you have favorites among their suite of plugins that they offer?
Oh yeah. I mean, the 1073, 33609, LA3A, LA2A, the UAD Cambridge EQ, fantastic. RMX16, I grew up on the RMX16, fabulous. EMT 140, the 250, the 224. I mean, I use those all the time. Yeah, all the time.
Awesome.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
They're really great.
Yeah.
I just recently got into George Massenberg's his multiband. No, his parametric EQ. That's really cool. Also,
yeah.
Also, I have like they've just modeled the Millennia NSEQ2, which I have a hardware version of that, and but I'm mixing in the box, so I'll use that. Yeah. So there's a lot of utility in that suite.
Right.
I also have the Transient Designer. That is fabulous.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, so much great stuff.
Yeah, so much great stuff. Yeah. But that's it. I use a lot of those, and then I might have a couple of the Sonox plugins, or the UAD version or the standalone versions, and I find like that's a pretty effective toolbox for me, and I can get pretty much everything I need from that.
All right. That's great.
Yeah, no, it's fabulous. Yeah.
It does make you much more efficient when you're not scrolling through a huge long list and trying to pick the right thing.
Yeah, pick the right thing. Sometimes do you really know what the right thing is? Like I know that I can get what I want out of these tools. Like to me, they're very musical, and they have really easy user interfaces. Like they're very intuitive, and they're elegant, and they're well crafted. So and they model like the real thing. So there's a certain familiarity for that. And when you see new things come out, you think, do I really know how that's going to operate? And I might spend 10 or 15 minutes trying to get something out of it, and ultimately I don't know the piece of gear well enough. It doesn't matter who the manufacturer is. Like, you might lose what that creative spark is. It's a bit like stopping in the middle of a mix and saying, "Oh, I'll just answer one email."
Right.
Well, 25 minutes later, you've answered 20, and you're completely out of the zone. And I feel that way with plugins. Like it's kind of like you really need to know what you are trying to do and how easily you can achieve that with something.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. And just the fact that, as you mentioned with user interfaces, then it becomes second nature to you.
Yeah.
To just grab the knob that you need or whatever the control is, so you can work much more quickly and efficiently.
Yeah, and I have a D command, so I put everything on the surface, so it's it's very easy to feel like you have a tactile response, as opposed to doing with a mouse, which is not as elegant.
Right. So you mentioned that you do some pre-master processing.
Yeah.
How heavily do you process there? And do you send the mastering engineer pretty much a finished kind of a thing and just expect them to tweak it, or is it still open to their interpretation?
No, I try and get what I want to hear, and then I'll go to the mastering. I'll go to the mastering with the knowledge that I'm going to hire somebody really great that I trust implicitly, and that they're going to hear something that I haven't heard, and they're going to bring something to bear on it. And it might just be a small tweak, but it could be a significant tweak, because at that level, and at that level of detail, you can really extract a lot more with like quarter dB or a half dB. That's kind of surprising, and I always learn something when I go to mastering.
Right.
So I use Bob Ludwig, Greg Calby, a lot of great guys out there, and it's great to bear witness to hearing your work in their room and then seeing what they do, just to bring in a little extra dimension to it, or extract something from the mix that you didn't quite hear.
Yeah, just have that little extra perspective.
Yeah. But I like to hear it. Like I like to feel that when my mix is complete, that it could go out as is. Maybe just maybe a little bit extra level gain for it to be competitive. But other than that, I feel like tonally it should be pretty close.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So do you insert those plugins on that pre-master aux? Yeah. Do you mix into those, or do you apply those?
No, I mix into it. Yeah. So I'm actually hearing all the choice, because I'm only using so few. I'm actually engaging them pretty early on. Like I get a basic balance, and then I start engaging that processing. So I'm now hearing what the processing is doing to my balance, and I might modify and I will modify the balance based on that. But I'm already hearing it now in a much more like record form.
Right.
Like it's not like from a good recording. It's now like, oh yeah, this sounds like it's like getting close to a finished mix. So I'm actually responding to what I think the end user is going to hear, and ultimately, my job is to satisfy the artist, or at a bare minimum, but also I want to exceed their expectations. Right. So if they're sitting there and they've got a big broad smile on their face, and go, wow, that's really great. And then you've done a good job. Now you hope the broader public get to hear it in the same light and feel the same way, but ultimately you're serving the artist, and that's what we're hired to do.
Is the artist generally there when you're mixing?
Sometimes. Yeah, sometimes it depends. Yet again, depends on whether they're living or travel to New York, or if I'm traveled somewhere where they're residing. It's much easier to mix when they're in the room. Yeah. Or at least when they're around, so that I can work on an idea and then they can come back in and listen with fresh ears. Having to send mixes up overnight and then wait for a response, that's a little more difficult, because you're not sure what the response is going to be. You know what you think of it, you think it sounds good, but you don't know really until you've done a couple. For a new artist, you don't really know what their taste is, so you have to learn what their taste is. Right. So, if you're doing a 10-song record, the first couple of mixes, there might be a lot more give and take. Oh no, I meant to, I wanted the guitars to be a little bit more heavy on that section, and we like light bass and, that kind of stuff. And then as you get further into the process, you realize, oh yeah, they don't like a lot of bass, or they like a lot of bass, you know, and vocals need to be forward or vocals need to be back. You learn quickly. So the next iteration of mixes, like 3, 4, and 5, you're probably hitting the mark closer, and then, you know, by the time you get to the end, you're probably getting very few comments.
Right.
But it's also nice to see their reaction when they hear for the first time in the room and sitting in the spot where you sit, because that's where, you know, I'm making all my judgment calls about why I made those choices.
Right.
You know, they're not arbitrary choices.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right. So I always like to ask, when I have someone like yourself who has so much experience on wonderful projects and operates at such a high level, what is it that makes a great artist?
Well, I would like to think that their fearlessness to just reveal themselves.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they are born to be an artist, and they have to create, and the pursuit of that creativity is what drives them, and to be part of that, and to be, you know, part of that team of collaborators that helps realize that is just, you know, it's a really unique position to be in.
Right.
And many times you look back on your career and you realize you entered a project at a certain stage, maybe at the beginning or maybe towards the end, and how your input really affected that record, and, you know, how meaningful that is, personally, and also to the artist, and also to ultimately the end user, which is their fans.
Right.
You know, that people have this emotional connection to music, and our job is to make it sound as otherworldly as possible, right? It has to be larger than life. You know, even if it's just an acoustic guitar and a flute, it still has to have this thing that draws the listener in. And if you're part of that, that's a really unique position to be in. And having the experience of working with so many different records, you realize there are certain things you can do in the recording to help draw the listener in, but ultimately you still need a great song, great arrangement, great performances, and great sounds.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the magic, right?
And that is the magic, yeah. Right. But the artistry, the artist has to have the artistry. Like, it has to, they have to have that desire and that ambition to, like, really reveal themselves, you know, because that's what makes it really an authentic record.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Kevin, you've been so generous sharing so much with us here today. I appreciate you taking the time.
It's my pleasure.
Thrill to have you here, and thanks for doing the workshop.
Oh,
and,
thanks to UAD for creating such great plugins.
Absolutely, yeah. We're very grateful to them for sponsoring your visit. I hope you'll come back.
I will absolutely
come back soon and enlighten us even more.
I'm more than happy to.
Pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you
very much.
Okay.
And thank you for joining me here at GearFest 2018. I'm Mitch Gallagher.